Hey everyone, it's Michael. This is one of the 2 bonus episodes that I mentioned in my recent announcement, and features an interview I recently conducted with author Douglas Brunt. Doug recently published his first nonfiction work, The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel. It's a really interesting book that's equal parts biography and mystery, and dives into a slice of history that I'd never really paid much attention to before. In case you don't really recognize the name Rudolf Diesel, after all, I didn't, he was an integral figure during the industrial era, and was responsible for creating the diesel engine, which played a big role in the evolving world of shipping and transportation. Hell, it still does more than a century later. In the lead up to World War I, Diesel was seemingly in a state of personal and professional flux, and had a lot of intriguing possibilities opened up to him because of his innovation, as well as a lot of pressures being put on him by major figures in the world, among them Kaiser Wilhelm II and John D. Rockefeller. But then, during an overnight crossing of the English Channel in September of 1913, Diesel disappeared, seemingly vanishing into the night. His disappearance has spawned a lot of intriguing theories and conspiracy theories over the years, and that's something that Doug and I dive into during our conversation. Would you mind telling me and the listener a little bit about yourself and kind of what started your career as a writer?
Well, it's a second act for me. I am from the East Coast. I grew up in Philly, and after college moved out to California, then DC. I initially had been more on the business side of things. I was a executive in a software company, and had been there for a number of years, rose up to be CEO of the software company, which was a great experience. It was, a very small company to start. And I think there are a lot of overlaps between entrepreneurship and writing. It's a very creative process to be an entrepreneur, and you come in and sort of write the next chapter of the company each day. Although the company got a little bigger and I was less happy with it. I was newly married-ish and actually on to the second kid when I was finally really feeling very ground down about it. And I was walking in Central Park, living in New York City at the time, walking in Central Park, strolling the kids with my wife. And she was saying, my gosh, you seem kind of, short-tempered and tired. And I was like, honey, it's just grinding me down. I was traveling a lot for work. And while I'd been traveling on planes and waiting at airport terminals for planes, I'd been toying around with the idea for a book, a fictional story. And, I was getting ready to finish it up, just the first draft, but I never thought anyone would see it. I didn't even think my wife would see it, but she wanted to read it. So she read it. She thought it was good. And then longer story short, she liked it. I sold the company. I got an agent, got a publishing deal. And that was my first novel. And I wrote 2 more novels. This book, The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel, is my first nonfiction book. But I never took an MFA, a fine arts class, or did a lot of actual, classroom study of fiction writing or any writing, really. I mean, other than business persuasive writing, I did a lot of course. But it's kind of a second act. The first novel is 2012. And so I was 41 when the first book came out.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was going to ask, I know you wrote Ghost of Manhattan, and that was a fictional work. And I was going to ask, what about this story made you jump to nonfiction?
That's a great question, because in the beginning, I almost wrote this as historical fiction, as I have been a novelist in prior works. I didn't know anything about diesel. Like most people, I'd pull up to the fueling station and see diesel. I just thought it was like a different kind of gas or something. And didn't really put it together that it's a fundamentally different kind of engine that serves different purposes and can do different things with different benefits. And so I, about 8 years ago, bought a boat, like an older boat, and it was slightly bigger, needed a lot of work. And I was at the boatyard with the guy talking about what to do with it. And he said, well, the first thing you should do for a boat like this is get rid of these old gasoline engines and repower it with diesels. And I had no idea. So this was my first foray into it. I'm like, well, why? What's the difference between diesel? And he launched into this whole thing that 100% of boat fires come from gasoline engines, 0 from diesel. You can take a lit match, drop it into a barrel of diesel fuel, and nothing will happen. The fuel is completely stable. They're not fumes. And it's about 3 or 4 times as efficient. So on a 200-gallon tank of fuel, you can go almost 4 times as far. And so I did repower it with diesels then. So I was then a diesel owner. And about a year later or so, I was in between novels and sort of tinkering around the internet to hopefully find some idea that would catch, and came across this list of mysterious disappearances at sea. And on the list was Rudolf Diesel. And so that was the beginning of the rabbit hole. And I guess we can get into some of this as we go, but there's so little written about him in the English language. It's really incredible how underappreciated a figure he is. And in part, that's part of the caper. I mean, this book in reviews is called The Greatest Caper of the 20th Century. The reason he's not known today and that his history over the last 100 years has been paved over is in connection with the caper in the book. And so very little written about him in the English language. A biography in the 60s, a biography in the 80s, both by academic publishers, really, and sort of small print. They weren't big biographies in any way. So it's hard to find stuff on him. And so that's why initially I was thinking, well, maybe I'll just do historical fiction. I can sort of fill in the dialogue and, I'll have liberty to make some things up. And then the more I got into it, I got into archives, and then I started finding incredible stuff. And then I started to have a sense. So he disappears, and we'll talk about that. I started to have a theory of the case. And so this biography becomes a sort of investigation of the case. And as I found more information, I realized this had to be nonfiction. I had to tell the story for real.
Yeah. I got an advanced copy of the book a couple weeks ago, and I'd read through it. I blazed through it. I love stories like this where they mix, where you mix, kind of like the biographic tale of Rudolf Diesel, which is, like you said, like this historical figure that, played such a huge part in our modern history, but has kind of been forgotten about. And I like how you mixed that with kind of the almost whodunit nature of his disappearance and how all that played out. And it was just really well done. I'm just, as a fan of the book, I just want to say great job.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, part of that was just stumbling into it. I feel like I hooked on to this big, beautiful fish in a way. I was fascinated by the man, but then as I got into the story and Disappearance, I thought, my gosh, there's a whole other element to this story that I can tell, because you've read it, so it's a circumstantial case, of course. It's as a matter of course, it's 110 years old, so there's no one who's there who's like, I saw the knife go in. There's not that kind of stuff. But the truth is, most murder cases are solved with circumstantial evidence. It's very rare that someone is seeing the actual crime, and actually witness testimony is the most unreliable anyway.
Yeah.
But I put the case to the jury, and most, if not, just about every historian or former intelligence operative from the UK and the US has come out and said, this is absolutely what happened. So as readers get into it and get into the investigation, you'll see what happened to Diesel in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. I just want to take a step back, kind of talk about Diesel, his work during his lifetime. Growing up, the scientific and kind of technological stuff was always kind of lost on me. So growing up, I never really knew the difference between a diesel engine and a regular engine. So can you kind of just give the listeners a rundown on what Diesel did differently with his engine and why that was such a big deal at the time? Because I found it super fascinating.
If you go back to the era of James Watt, that was the first practical steam engine that could be used in industry. Steam technology goes back to ancient Egyptians who would use steam power to move heavy doors and things like that. But in the 1770s, James Watt developed a steam engine that could be used for work. And if you look at a unit of fuel, a steam engine in that era could derive about 2% of the energy out of that unit of fuel. So it was incredibly inefficient. You would shovel mountains of coal into a furnace that would burn the coal to deliver heat to boil a vat of water into steam, and the steam would then move the gears of an engine. It's literally the same principle as boiling a pot of water on the stove. And so the image that I think you probably maybe remember from the book that I use in the book is the scene from that movie Titanic with Leonardo DiCaprio. And when the camera pans down into the belly of the ship and you see these dozens, and on a ship like the Titanic, there'd be hundreds of these men, sweaty, shoveling coal into this orange fiery furnace. And that coal, that fiery furnace is then burning and heating a vat of water into steam. There's a chimney apparatus to deliver all the soot and partially burnt particles of coal out into the atmosphere through these big chimney funnels on the deck of the ship. So incredibly inefficient and filthy pollution technology. But that's how we powered big industry in those days, the big capital ships and the big power plants and big inland industry as well. Eventually, in the 1860s, the first internal combustion engines developed, and these would run on gaseous fuels like benzene and methane and things like that. And that's what Carl Benz used for his first car in like the 1880s. But it looked like almost like a three-wheeled kind of scooter. It was on a 1/2 horsepower, eventually like 1.5 horsepower. And these were very small, weak engines running on either gaseous fuels or kerosene or eventually gasoline. But they couldn't do much work. Like, it could really just sort of power something like slightly larger than a bicycle, really.
Mm-hmm.
The diesel engine kind of merged the best of both. It was internal combustion, and it took advantage of the superior metal casting technologies that came around in the late 1880s into the 1890s. Because back in James Watt's day, in order to seal the pipes, they would use rope and leather and things like that. You can imagine how much heat and pressure is lost in that kind of a seal.
Yeah.
In Diesel's day, they would use superior metals with superior casting. And what he delivered was a pressure engine. So instead of a spark that was used in kerosene or gasoline engines, he used compressed air to combust the fuel. It's the same technology as a bicycle pump. When you thrust down the plunger on the bicycle pump to send out the air, after you've pumped a few tires, you realize it's getting kind of hot. And it's the same idea. It's an enclosed cylinder. The air is compressed down to extreme pressures, like 1,000 pounds per square inch. And under that pressure, enough heat is generated to combust fuel that is otherwise stable. And so it was a high torque engine. It was far more efficient. It was far more compact. So instead of, in the steam age, some rural artisan who needs power out in his shop, a steam engine of that era was as big as the shop. So he was delivering something that was much more compact, much more fuel efficient. From James Watt day, it was 2% efficient. By the 1860s, 80s, these other combustion engines were maybe the newer steam technologies were 6 to 7. The combustion engines were maybe 12, and he got to 38% fuel efficiency, which for that era was multiple better than any other kind of engine. So it was totally game changing for industry, and as you know, other benefits that made the engine practical in other environments like submarines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just in case listeners are worried, like, this book it's not a technical manual. It's just the way that you explained it in the book is a lot easier for me to comprehend than like in my old tech shops where it was just like, I didn't understand the difference at all. But
I try in the book, you sort of breeze through it just enough to understand why it matters so much. But it's definitely, there's a tiny bit of combustion engines for dummies, but it's really more of a biography of this fascinating man, but really a sort of a caper and a whodunit.
Yeah, and it's just interesting learning about how influential he was, kind of like in the industrial sense. But you do a good job of going through his backstory and explaining that he had this like really rough childhood, which I wasn't expecting. That he like grew up in war-torn France and then immigrated to London, where his family basically lived in poverty. It was just it was a really interesting story that I had no idea about.
Yeah, he really was. Often I think of him sort of on the outside looking in. They were this Germanic family of Germanic origin living in Paris when, ever since Napoleon, that's not a great combo, but they loved living in Paris and got along with everybody. But at the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War, they were basically evicted from Paris. And as you say, went to London, where he lived in the exact neighborhood as the setting of Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. And he was there at the same age, 12 years old, as the title character, Oliver Twist. And so you can imagine it was that kind of tenement housing and poverty, and kids of that age, instead of going to school, marching off into factories and mills of, right in the guts of the industrial age.
Yeah, it was just really interesting. I had no idea. Kind of like skimming throughout the book, you kind of tell his story in parallel to a couple of other people, including John D. Rockefeller and Kaiser Wilhelm II. Can you kind of tell us about their kind of how they factor into the story in a sense?
Yeah, and to that, often the way I tell it is to just skip to the end and then come back, which is that on September 29, 1913, right before World War I, Diesel is traveling from Belgium to Great Britain on an overnight passenger ferry, and he disappears. And so he had dinner with his traveling companions, allegedly, and then they went to bed. They're going to make plans to meet in the morning. But he's not there. They hold the ship at sea and they search it. They can find nothing but his hat and his coat folded by the rail at the stern of the ship, seeming to mark where he went overboard. And it's hard to describe it now because, as we've discussed, the history of him has kind of been paved over. Nobody knows, most people don't know there was a Rudolf Diesel who invented the diesel engine. Mm-hmm. But in that time, in 1913, it would be like Elon Musk disappearing today, to put it in our terms. So newspaper headlines around the world were splashed with news of his disappearance, of the great inventor, from the headlines of the New York Times to papers all around Western Europe and out to Russia, talking about the mystery of what had happened. And they were presuming suicide because the coat and the hat seemed to mark that path off the ship. But there were also two stories emerging around murder. One suspect was Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor of Germany, and the other was John Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil, and at that time the richest man in the world. And they each had a motive to do it. In the case of Wilhelm, it was because by 1913, the diesel engine had emerged as the only engine that could service a submarine or a U-boat. Gasoline and kerosene engines would not work. They, when you submerged, there were fumes from the fuel. It was spark ignition. There were constant fires that would just kill the crew. And there wasn't enough fuel efficiency in those engines to allow the submarine to get anywhere useful. With diesel, there were no fires, no fumes, 4 times the range, so you could actually get the submarine out into open sea lanes and control shipping. So every navy of every major power was scrambling for diesel power to build their submarine fleets, in particular at that time, Great Britain and Germany. Mm-hmm. And the reason Diesel was traveling across the North Sea on that day was he was heading to the opening, sort of the groundbreaking ceremony of a new diesel engine manufacturing company in Great Britain, of which he was a board director and co-founder. And the mandate of that new British diesel engine manufacturing company was to build submarine diesels for the Royal Navy. So you can imagine the Kaiser was, upon getting wind of this, was not happy. Rockefeller's motive was very different. It was around the fuel, of course. And that was because Rudolf Diesel, when traveling in the United States in 1912, for example, told everyone, I can break the American fuel monopoly and I don't need a law to do it. I don't need the Sherman Antitrust Act. I can do it with the power of my technology. And in 1900, Rudolf had won the Paris World Fair with a diesel engine burning peanut oil for fuel. Mm-hmm. So Diesel was saying, we don't need petroleum out of the ground. We don't need any petroleum-derived product. We have farmers. We can grow our own fuel. The diesel engine can burn very well on vegetable or nut oil. It can also burn on coal tar, which is achieved through the coking process of coal, and didn't need oil, and wanted each country to be able to have its fuel independence. And Rockefeller at that time was on slightly shaky ground because he had just lost the kerosene business to Edison's electric light bulb. Rockefeller became the richest man in the world from 1870 to 1900 because he was in the illumination business. He was selling kerosene for lighting, and gasoline was actually a waste product that he would throw away. And it was only in the early 1900s that the automobile was emerging as a market for gasoline. But then diesel posed this existential threat to that market. And so the oil trusts had reason to get rid of diesel as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just really interesting the way that it plays out in the book. You have kind of like these converging stories that build up to September of 1913. And then, of course, when Rudolf Diesel disappears, it's the original newspaper articles all basically hint at suicide. But then, shortly after that, people start asking more questions and the story gets a little shakier. And just in the book, it's really interesting the way that it plays out.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And I usually don't spoil it, and your readers might appreciate it if we don't. The most I usually say is, it wasn't suicide.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you, at the end, you kind of like, you develop your own theory near the end of the book. I don't know how far in detail you want to get into, because, I don't want to spoil it, because it is really interesting. But do you want to talk about that a little?
Yes, there are lots of things at play in that time, and one of the things is, as you were saying, if you take this quarter century and in particular that 10 years leading up to World War I, and you follow these three figures, Diesel, Kaiser Wilhelm, and Rockefeller, you really get a sense of what was happening in the world. You also get a sense of that sort of Gilded Age period of time. It all kind of comes to life. I jokingly refer to it as Downton Abbey, the early seasons, before that hinge point in history of World War I, when so many empires collapsed, the world started living a different way. The sort of urbanization and centralization of economies was already happening with the industrial age, but World War I certainly accelerated all of that. But other figures emerge as well. I mean, the British play a key role, and one of the main tensions in the book is this Anglo-German naval arms race. So the Kaiser is in part British. He was the favorite grandchild of Queen Victoria, and Queen Victoria's oldest daughter married a German prince. So he's sort of half British, and has always envied the British, and in particular has always envied their navy. And so he is going hard on building a German navy to rival the British, and also to establish an imperial structure and overseas colonies that can provide raw materials back to Germany to help its massively growing industry. He wants to compete, in fairness, with Britain, who already has an imperial structure in many colonies around the world, as do France and Italy and others. So he wants all that, but to do it, he feels he needs a strong navy. On the other half of that battle, you have the British, and at that time, while Churchill has been largely studied in World War II, and before World War II, he was the First Lord of the Admiralty. He was in the same position before World War I. He became First Lord of the Admiralty, which is the top post of the Royal Navy. Churchill took that role over in 1911. And so he was charged with preparing the Royal Navy, and their main preoccupation at that time was the German Navy, the growing German Navy. So Diesel's like right in the middle of this, because the Germans start to realize that they can't really compete on the battleship front. Britain has introduced the dreadnought and then followed on with even more of the dreadnought class. They have all the infrastructure in place, and have for 100 years, to develop the best capital ships for their navy more quickly than anyone else. And so Germany, for a time, is trying to build battleships, but then they realize they really can't keep up with Britain. They can't catch them. But the Kaiser has this idea that, well, we can maybe have a very deadly and effective submarine fleet. And therefore, suddenly, Diesel is the most important guy to both navies. And so that tension is there between the two. And Diesel, from the looking at his letters and his diaries, seems to become more concerned with Germany's nationalistic and aggressive foreign policies in this sort of 1906, 7, 8 range. And he's spending a lot more time in America, spending a lot more time in Great Britain. His friend circles seem to involve more of those folks as well. And so there's some anxiety about where he, where his loyalties are lying among the German folks.
Yeah, I can't say it enough. It's really interesting, the entire book. But throughout the book, you kind of point out how Rudolf Diesel, his view of nationalism continues to deteriorate, and that kind of leads him to stray from his Germanic roots. But yeah, it kind of leads up to September of 1913, and then his disappearance. And there's, the predominant theory seems to be that he took his own life, and that's based off of, he left money for his wife and all these different goodbye notes and stuff that he left. But this theory that you developed it's really interesting, and like you said, it's almost like this historical whoddunit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's just really interesting.
It gets to some of the I love some of these there are a number of books, there's one by Howard Bloom about Germany's World War I espionage apparatus, where they were doing lots of spying and sabotage here in the U.S. Before we even got into the war. But I mean, we were sending about 1,000 horses a day. We weren't actually fighting, but we were supplying the Allies. And the British had a very sophisticated intelligence apparatus at that time too. And again, Churchill is right in the mix of all that stuff. Yep. There's so many fun stories like the book has a number of footnotes, and I tried to get a good balance of footnotes because I find that they can be annoying. Just the physicality of it. You're reading here, and then you've got to go here, and then got to go back up here. So I wanted to make sure they wouldn't be annoying. I tried to flip it and make sure that they were all enough of a little treasure that you might actually look forward to it. So look forward to going down for that little footnote. But one of them is about Churchill and the origins of the tank. Just as one example, the tank was not around in the beginning of World War I, but Churchill felt with the trench warfare, there needed to be some kind of vehicle that could, span a trench. And the army wasn't doing it. So he said, well, I'm going to do it. So he created the Land Ship Committee because he was over in the Navy. It wasn't his purview, but he did it anyway, found a way. And so they have this secret development area and they're bringing in parts, but even the security around the development area didn't know what was going on. So they kept saying, oh, these are for water tanks. So we're bringing in tank parts. And so that just became what they called it. And then the name in the end stuck. They just call it, there's no reason it should be called a tank. That makes no sense, except for there was this secret operation led by Churchill, and the name comes from that.
Yeah, that's really fun. It's also really interesting. You kind of make the parallel between Diesel's disappearance and Operation Mincemeat, which is something that it's a story that I covered on one of my podcasts 5-6 years ago, something like that. And, some people might know that there's a Netflix movie about it now, but it's just like a really interesting parallel and, all this early, like a century ago intelligence. It's just, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to, congratulate you on such a great book. Hopefully it's selling well and you guys are getting good numbers, but, I just wanted to thank you for taking time to chat with me. And, do you have anything else you want to say about the book or any other notes about Rudolf Diesel?
No, that's it. I mean, I think in the end, one thing I've been saying a little bit is, there's this term that's often used now, technical sweetness. And it refers to the feeling of excitement or euphoria that a scientist or an engineer can have as they advance their technology and their innovation. And that feeling of excitement can overwhelm any sense of caution that maybe they should have about, should I advance this technology? And the most famous example of that in history is Oppenheimer with the bomb. And it's also used today a lot in connection with AI. We're barreling ahead so fast, but should we? And that's one of the great tensions in Diesel's life is, he did this incredible achievement, this great innovation. He had intended for it to be, as we discussed earlier, a power source for small business and for rural economies and decentralized economies, and certainly not an implement of war. And yet it became all of those. It was the opposite of what he intended. It became the power source of big business and centralized economies and of war. And so, and he watched that irony play out in his life. It wasn't posthumous at all. And there were years there as well where he was working hard to develop it for the submarine, as Oppenheimer was working to develop the bomb. So it's not as though someone else converted it to the submarine. He worked actively to make that happen too. And so it's later in life, later he kind of, talked about his, how upset he was that it was used in that way. But in the very first years of the engine's emergence, he was helping to make it happen too. So it's an interesting tension in his life that how the engine ultimately became used and how it's been used in the 120 years or 110 years now, almost to the day of his disappearance.
It's a really interesting story, even outside of the murder mystery stuff, which I think my listeners will be interested in. It's just an interesting story of, someone who's almost been forgotten to history, but who played such a big role in it. And I just wanted to commend you again for doing a great job, laying out a story.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for speaking to us, and hopefully we'll get to chat with you again soon about another book.
Well, I would love that. Definitely.
Yeah. Sounds great. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you found this story and the interview interesting. Like I said, this was one that I'd never really paid much attention to before, but I found to be infinitely fascinating. Thanks again to Douglas Brunt for appearing on the show. Make sure to check out his book, The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel, at your local bookstore or even your library. Like I said, it's a really intriguing book that does a good job of telling this complicated, mysterious story, and for what it's worth, I would definitely give it the Unresolved stamp of approval. Anyhow, I'll talk to you all again very soon. Up next is an interview that I conducted with NPR producer and podcast host Justin Glanville. whose podcast, Mary and Bill, an Ohio Cold Case, has become another recent obsession of mine. That bonus episode will be dropping over the next week or so. Until then, I hope you all stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you later.